Okay, this is an SSU-3 hooked up, ready to test. Basically, everything is the same for an SSU-3 as it is for a 2. There are just a couple differences, like the connectors are the .156 connectors on this board as opposed to the .100 connectors on the SSU-2. J1's a 15-pin connector, but and the key pins on pin 10 and 11 through 15 are not used. But the hookups are the same, so pins 1 and 2 get hooked to ground, pin 3 gets hooked to 5 volts, and pin 9 gets hooked to 12 volts. We need a ground connection, so I've hooked into this capacitor over here on the negative side for our test probe. And then the speaker is wired up to pins 1 and 9 on J2. You have your volume control over here at the bottom, your amplifier section down over here. You have the same 76 477s that are used to generate the sounds. The difference is that 2 of them are socketed on this board for the explosion and the sound effects. And this is advantageous because if it turns out that you don't have the explosion sound, or you don't have, or you have a missing sound effect sound, one of the things that you can easily do is you can swap these 2 chips here and see if you then get one sound and you lose the other. So that's a big plus, having these 2 chips socketed. The one that's not socketed over here, this is for the chimes. And these transistors, resistors, diodes, and capacitors that are here in the bottom corner of the board, that's what triggers the chimes with the 76 477 here. And we have our 74 154 decoder for the inputs and outputs. And basically we're going to do the same thing with this board that we just did with the SSU-2. So the first thing we're going to do is plug it in, and you're going to notice that it actually has a different startup sound than the SSU-2. One of the other differences with this board from the SSU-2, beyond the fact that it's a double-sided board, is that there were additional circuits put on the input side of the 74 154 for finer control and triggering of sounds. And that allowed them to create this sort of cycling startup sound when the board is first powered on. So we're now going to apply power to the board, and you'll hear the startup sound. And that's the startup sound for this board. Now, again, if you don't get any sounds, touch the volume pot with your finger, and you should get a buzzing. If you don't, again, suspect the pot or one or both amps or the capacitors that are in the output circuit to the speaker. So once you've done that, you want to then ground the input pins on J1, and you'll get the exact same sounds by grounding the input pins on here that you did the SSU-2. So if you ground pin 5, you'll get the gun sound. Pin 6 gives you the ricochet. Pin 7 gives you the explosion. And pin 8 will give you the horse sound. So if you ground these and you get those sounds, then you know that you have a good connection from J1 to the 74-154, and that this is doing its job decoding these input signals and triggering the right sounds to go on the output side. But of course, we want to test all of the sounds on the board, so to do that requires shorting each of the pins on the 74-154, and we're going to do that now. And I will note the differences between the SSU-2 and the SSU-3 as we go along. So first we start with pin 1, and that's the D chime. Pin 2 is the C chime. Pin 3 is the B chime. Pin 4 is the A chime. 5 is the H. 6 is the G. 7 is the F. And 8 is the gun sound. And if I ground pin 5, you notice I get the same sound as pin 8. Now pin 9 on the SSU-3 gives you a warble sound. On the SSU-2, this gave you like that rattlesnake sound. So you'll hear the difference. This is one of the slight sound differences between the SSU-2 and SSU-3. So here's pin 9. This is the warble. Okay. Pin 10 is the E chime. And then we come around to pin 13, which on the SSU-2 is called the horse sound, and on the SSU-3 it's called a pony sound, because the shot in OCI is for pony rides. But I think there really isn't a difference between the horse and the pony here. So here's the pony sound. And again, if I touch pin 8 on J1, I should get the same sound. So as you see, that's the same as pin 13, the output in pin 13. Then pin 14 is the howl sound. That's obnoxious. Pin 15 is the ricochet. And that I will get as well if I touch pin 6. And then finally on pin 16 is the explosion sound. And that's the same sound I get on pin 7. So you see here, this board is working just fine. It's generating all the sounds where I would expect them to, and outputting them the way that they should. So this soundboard is fine. One other thing to note, which I didn't point out earlier, but I'll point out here, is that because of the architecture of this board, where you have 3 different sound synths generating sounds, some sounds can play in combination. So for example, you can actually have the explosion sound playing at the same time that the ricochet sound is playing, because one is being handled by the explosion's being handled by this chip, and the ricochet sound is being handled by this chip. So if both chips are triggered very close to each other, actually both sounds will play. And I'm going to do that right now so you can see that. So I'm going to trigger the explosion first, and then I'm going to trigger the ricochet. And you could hear the ricochet playing at the same time as the explosion. But you can't play two sounds simultaneously that are generated on the same chip. So for example, if I wanted the horse and the howl will not play at the same time. So I'm going to trigger the howl first, and then I'm going to trigger the horse, and you'll see as soon as I trigger the horse, the howl will stop. So see, I'll do that again. So some sounds will play simultaneously with this board and other sounds won't. So in the game you may notice that some sounds get truncated, and basically if it's a sound effect sound that you then trigger a different sound effect sound, the first sound effect will stop and the second will play. But if the explosion is playing, it will continue to play even if, for example, you are generating chime sounds. And I'm going to show you that one as well. So I'm going to trigger the explosion. And you can hear while the explosion was playing, I was still getting chime sounds. I'll do it with the howl, and then I'll do the same thing with the chime. See? So that's why you get some sounds playing in combination and others you don't on these boards. So that's it. And next we'll show you side by side, or one right after the other, the sounds between an SSU-2 and an SSU-3.